In the previous lessons, we talked about the economics of stolen credentials and why password reuse creates vulnerability. Now we want to look at the technical mechanics of credential stuffing. How are these attackers actually testing millions or billions of credentials at scale? We'll talk about the sophisticated automation, infrastructure, and evasion techniques that make credential stuffing a viable attack method despite defensive countermeasures. So we want to establish the scope of what we're discussing. A credential stuffing campaign might test hundreds of millions or billions of username and password combinations against dozens or hundreds of different target websites. This happens over days or weeks using distributed infrastructure across thousands of IP addresses. No human could manually test even a tiny fraction of these credentials. It's purely an automation issue, and attackers have built sophisticated solutions. Tools like Sentry MBA, Storm, Sniper, OpenBullet, and others provide complete credential testing frameworks. They handle authentication to thousands of different websites, manage proxy rotation to hide the attacker's location, solve CAPTCHAs automatically or through solving services, parse responses to determine success or failure, and organize results for further exploitation. These tools come with pre-built configuration files for testing credentials against specific websites. The configurations handle the unique authentication flows, form fields, and response patterns for each target site. An attacker doesn't need to understand how Amazon's login works. They just load the Amazon configuration file, and the tool handles everything. Most of these tools are freely available or cost minimal amounts. The barrier to entry is extremely low. So, automated credential stuffing starts where the attacker starts with a database of stolen credentials, email and password pairs from breach data. They load this database into their credential stuffing tool along with configuration files for their target websites. The tool begins systematically testing each credential pair against each target, sending an authentication request with the username and password, receiving the response, analyzing whether login succeeded or failed, and recording the result. Successful logins are flagged for further exploitation. Failed logins are discarded or noted for potential password mutation testing. The process continues through the entire credential database. With proper configuration and sufficient infrastructure, tools can test thousands or tens of thousands of creds per minute against each target site. So obviously, testing millions of credentials from one single IP address would be immediately obvious and easily blocked. So the attackers need to distribute their attacks across many different IP addresses. They use residential proxy networks, compromised home routers, and devices that provide legitimate-looking residential IP addresses. They use data center proxy services that provide thousands of IP addresses for rent. They use compromised servers, cloud instances, and so on to launch attacks from a diverse set of locations. And they route through VPN services and Tor to obscure their actual location. So they could be coming from the US but look like they're coming from Russia. They could be coming from Russia but look like they're coming from China, etc., etc. And using a whole bunch of different IP addresses makes it so that if somebody blocks 1 or 2 or 10 or 20, it's not effective. They just pop up with a different IP. And then they'll slow down their request per IP address to avoid triggering rate limits that are in place. Attackers use those automated CAPTCHA solving services like we mentioned, 2CAPTCHA, anti-CAPTCHA, and death by CAPTCHA. These services employ actual human workers who solve CAPTCHAs for pennies per solution. The credential stuffing tool encounters a CAPTCHA, sends it to the solving service, receives the solution within seconds, and continues the attack. The economics work because the attacker only pays for CAPTCHA solutions on successful logins or high-value targets. Testing 1 million credentials might only generate a few thousand CAPTCHAs if the tool is configured to avoid triggering them unnecessarily. More advanced attackers use AI machine learning models trained to solve specific CAPTCHA types automatically. That eliminates that minimal cost of the human solving services. Sophisticated credential stuffing tools don't just send authentication requests, they mimic legitimate user behavior to avoid detection. They include random delays between requests to simulate human typing and thinking time. They'll load the full login page, including images and style sheets, rather than sending only only the authentication request. They maintain sessions with proper cookie handling. They include realistic user agent strings that match common browsers and devices. They follow redirects and handle JavaScript challenges that legitimate browsers would process. This behavioral mimicry is constantly evolving as defensive systems become more sophisticated. Attackers perform success rate optimization, prioritizing testing credentials against high-value targets first: banking sites, cryptocurrency exchanges, major e-commerce platforms. They test credentials against multiple targets simultaneously to maximize the value extracted from each valid credential. They use email domain filtering to test credentials only against relevant sites, like testing Gmail credentials against Gmail and corporate email domains against VPNs and corporate resources. They implement smart retry logic, distinguishing between different failure types. A wrong password error might indicate the username exists, but the password is wrong, prompting password mutation attempts. Account locked error might indicate creds were valid, but the account has been secured, worth noting for later exploitation attempts. User not found error means a credential pair isn't valid for that service and shouldn't be retested. They're significantly working on their efficiency rather than just blindly running these tests. When a credential successfully authenticates, the tool does not just record the success. It tries to determine things like account value by checking account balance for financial accounts, age and reputation for social media, stored payment methods for e-commerce, and access levels for corporate accounts. It extracts information like recovery email addresses, phone numbers, connected account services, personal information for identity theft, and any stored financial instruments. It tests for multi-factor authentication and what type. Accounts without MFA are immediately more valuable for exploitation. This enrichment process transforms a simple username and password work into actionable intelligence about what the compromised account can be used for and how much it's worth. Services implement rate limiting to prevent credential stuffing, limiting how many login attempts can be made from a single IP address in a given time period. Attackers use several techniques to evade this. They distribute the attacks across thousands of IP addresses to stay below the rate limit thresholds, implement intelligent pacings staying just below detection thresholds, and rotating through different target services, testing credentials against multiple sites so no single site sees enough volume to trigger alerts. They also exploit implementation weaknesses in rate-limiting systems. Some rate limits only count failed logins, so successful logins don't increment counters. Some rate limits can be reset by changing user agent strings or clearing cookies. Some rate limits apply per endpoint, so attackers can rotate between different login endpoints. The result is that well-executed credential stuffing campaigns can operate for extended periods without triggering rate limits that would slow or stop the attack. Beyond rate limiting, services deploy various detection mechanisms to identify credential stuffing, and attackers work to avoid all of them. They avoid patterns indicating automation by randomizing request timing, varying request parameters, and simulating realistic browsing behavior before authentication attempts. They harvest and rotate browser fingerprints, the unique combination of browser characteristics that can identify individual users. This way they can work to appear as many different legitimate users rather than a single bot. And they monitor for changes in target site behavior that might indicate enhanced detection, adjusting their techniques in response. There's an insightful quote from the computer scientist Butler Lampson. In his paper on authentication in distributed systems, he wrote, "In a distributed system, you can secure the endpoints and secure the communication between them, but you cannot prevent an adversary from making requests. The best you can do is authenticate those requests and decide whether to honor them." Lampson identified the fundamental challenge that makes credential stuffing so difficult to prevent. Login systems must accept authentication attempts from the internet. That is their purpose. Cannot prevent attacks from trying to log in. You can only try to distinguish legitimate login attempts from attacks. Credential stuffing is a persistent problem because the attack uses the system exactly as designed. It just uses it with stolen credentials. Attackers benefit from volume in multiple ways. First, testing billions of creds means even low success rates produce large numbers of compromised accounts. Second, high volume makes detection difficult. Distinguishing credential stuffing attempts from legitimate failed logins is challenging when the malicious traffic is distributed across thousands of IP addresses and carefully paced to avoid triggering rate limits. And third, volume enables targeting multiple services simultaneously. While attacking one service, attackers simultaneously attack dozens of others, maximizing return on investment, ROI. And then when exact credential reuse fails, attackers try the variations through the password mutations like we talked about, cycling through dozens of predictable variations of the stolen passwords. They also employ password spraying, testing a small number of common passwords against many usernames, rather than testing many passwords against one username, which would trigger account logouts. They test one password against thousands of usernames, then move to the next common password. This approach avoids account lockout mechanisms while still achieving high success rates, since many people use common passwords. So once the attackers have successfully compromised thousands or millions of accounts, they now need to monetize them efficiently. The entire process is automated. Tools automatically categorize compromised accounts by type and value, extract relevant information, and queue them for appropriate monetization channels. Some attackers operate reselling platforms where they sell compromised accounts to others, and these platforms provide search functionality, bulk purchasing options, and even guarantees if the account doesn't work, they'll replace it. Understanding the technical sophistication of credential stuffing should inform your defense strategy. Don't assume that services can perfectly protect you. Their defensive systems are good but not perfect, especially against well-funded, sophisticated attackers using current tools and techniques. Monitor your accounts for suspicious activity. Attackers might gain access without triggering obvious alerts, but unusual login locations or unexpected account activity can indicate a compromise. Our next lesson will explore what happens after attackers successfully log in with the stolen credentials.